Last week, I kicked off a new sermon series that I've titled, Don't Waste Your Year. We're jumping into 2018. I think it's an appropriate time to think about what we're doing with our lives, what direction are we going, are we making our lives count? And I explained then that this series, while it says don't waste your year, could just as well say don't waste your life or make your life count. This is the principles in this short sermon series are the very principles that will help you to make your whole life count, not just this year. The last week, the focus was on setting goals, and I explained that there are two common storylines or plot lines in stories. You've got adventures and you have quests. Adventures are typically follow the main character as they jump from one experience to the next, one event to the next, kind of following them as they go through life, encountering whatever they do. There's no particular goal other than to have fun or to take risks or to have experiences, whatever the main character might want to do. But a quest, on the other hand, has a driving purpose. A quest is aimed at something. There's a goal, some task that needs to be accomplished, some end situation that everything is striving and moving towards. And my challenge last week for everyone was to make your life a quest, not merely an adventure. That you're not simply going from day to day, from week to week, just having cool experiences. I feel like doing this, and oh, this looks fun, and oh, we should try this. I challenge you to make your life a quest, to determine a goal, a purpose, something that is so important that everything else is now aimed at that everything is trying to accomplish that purpose. And my homework assignment, you get a little bit of homework in this sermon series. My homework assignment last week was for everyone to spend some time during the week reflecting and trying to articulate at least two types of goals. First, I challenged you to try to write down one singular overarching goal for your life. Well, what's the one thing that you want to be accomplished in your life more than anything else? If everything else fell apart, what's the one thing that you would want to happen? What's the one thing that you'd want to be remembered for? What's number one? What's most important in your life? I challenged you to try to write that down, articulate a single goal for your life. For Paul, that overarching supreme desire was to know and be with Jesus Christ. Knowing Christ intimately, being close and connected to Him, spending eternity with Him. That was more important to Paul than anything else. But under that primary goal, he had some secondary goals. I pointed to Romans chapter 15, where Paul explains that based on his giftings and experience and calling from God, he felt a priestly duty to bring the gospel to Gentiles, non-Jews. He felt uniquely called, equipped by God to minister to Gentiles that they might be an offering acceptable to God. And so that was kind of a secondary goal for him. And so he became a missionary, he became doing all these things, but all of that was under his primary aim of I want to know Christ, I want to be with Christ, I want to be close to Christ. So for Paul, goal number one, to know Christ intimately and personally, and goal number two was to preach the gospel that the Gentiles might come to know and love Jesus as well. So I challenged you to articulate what your number one goal in life was, and then to spell out some secondary goals. And you could put those under various categories, relational, financial, physical, spiritual, however you'd want to do that. You can put them under different categories, but what's primary and what are some secondary goals for your life? I want you to live a life of purpose and meaning and direction. I said last week that I would have gifts for people who did their homework, and so now is the time where the teacher calls to see who actually did what was assigned. So raise your hand if you're willing to say, yes, I did my homework, I wrote down some goals this week. Raise your hand. All right? I know everyone's kind of timid. This is not boasting, but good. I see some hands there. Now, of those who raised your hand, Put it back up and keep it up if you would accept and read a short, less than 100-page book if I were to give it to you. Highly recommend. Okay, we've got one hand. All right. Okay, here I got a couple. I'm gonna do that now. This is my gift for those who did their homework. Sharon, here you go. Good work. I saw a hand over there. Mike raising a hand. So while I walk around, I'm going to explain this book, and if there are other people who, if not enough people raise hands, pass it down. This is called a gospel primer for Christians learning to see the glories of God's love. I've got, I think I just gave away, I think the first one I gave away was my copy over there. I'm going to trade that with you, Sharon. Yeah, you've got a pre-read version. All right, two more. Anyone? Okay, Steve, I see you over there. One more. Gary, good work. All right. So this is a book. I'm just going to give a little plug for this book because we've got 5 or so more copies on the church book table on your way towards the parking lot. But this book, read recently, I highly recommend it. It's short. It's a book on the Gospels. It's the most, in my opinion, effective and concise summary of the gospel. The first section of this book is 31 reasons for rehearsing the gospel daily to yourself. 31 reasons why there is benefit for you to know the gospel and to preach the gospel to yourself. So that's section 1. Section 2 and section 3 are summaries of the gospel. First in prose form, second in poetry form, and then lastly there's a brief section on his personal testimony of the value of rehearsing the gospel daily. And as I think about setting goals and as we jump into what I'm going to talk about today, one of the reasons I kind of passed this out, and I've just been so edified by it lately, one of my goals for this year is to memorize section 2 of this book. It's essentially 41 sentences that summarize the gospel, the prose version of the gospel summary. And I just think it's so helpful, so profound, and so it's basically like a chapter length of the Bible, so not overwhelming, but I'm going to commit to at least a sentence a week, and you can hold me accountable to that. You can check on me. You get to be the one checking to see if I've done my homework, now that I'm putting it out there. But anyway, so last week was all about setting goals, primary goals, secondary goals. But have you ever noticed that there is a ginormous gap between setting a goal and accomplishing a goal? Setting a goal is the easy part. Like saying, I want this thing to happen is a piece of cake. Like that takes almost zero effort whatsoever. Wanting to be Christ-like, wanting to have a happy marriage, wanting to be debt-free, wanting to lose weight. The wanting is the easy part. The setting of goals is easy. I read a quote recently from James Clear, and he pointed out, he says, the real challenge is not determining if you want the result, but if you are willing to accept the sacrifices required to achieve your goal. Do you want the lifestyle that comes with your quest? Do you want the boring and ugly process that comes before the exciting and glamorous outcome? It's easy to sit around and think what we could do or what we'd like to do. It is an entirely different thing to accept the trade-offs that come with your goals. Everybody wants a gold medal. Few people want to train like an Olympian. Every one of us in this room has set and abandoned goals. We have wanted things, but experienced little to no progress in achieving those things. I suspect that all of our lives are littered with, past dreams that have been neglected, resolutions that have been forgotten. In fact, back in September, if you were here, I preached a sermon from the end of the book of 2 Timothy. And I explained in that sermon that that sometimes people are often hesitant to set goals for a very specific reason, namely that you have set goals and failed so many times that you're almost afraid to specify, to write down, to clarify a specific tangible goal for fear that you're just going to be disappointed one more time. And I asked the church at that point to raise their hand if that described them. And I was surprised to see almost half of the people in church said that sometimes they're hesitant to set goals because they've failed so many times, they just don't want to face the disappointment again. That might describe you here today. We've all experienced the disconnect between setting a goal and accomplishing that goal. I believe our goals are destined for failure if we never form the habits needed to move us toward our goals. Last week's sermon title was Simple, Set Goals. And most of these sermons are very concise titles. Set goals. Today is Form Habits. Goals without a commitment to the necessary underlying habits are worthless. Imagine a rowboat with a rudder. Your goals are like the rudder on that boat. They point you in the right direction. They set the trajectory that you're going in. That's kind of the function of goals, is to give direction to where you're going. But a rudder without movement is pointless. If you're just sitting there, it doesn't matter where your rudder is pointed, you're just going to drift along. The rudder is worthless if you don't actually move anywhere. The rudder sets the direction. The rudder is your goal, but the oars are the habits that move you little by little, moment after moment, closer and closer towards your goal. And most goals are achieved because we establish habits that keep us moving. Day after day, they don't get us there overnight, but the goals are accomplished because we've committed to the rowing. We've committed to the little things that will keep incrementally bringing us closer and closer to the goals that we've set for ourselves. Do you have habits in place that will sufficiently move you toward your goals? Because if you wrote down goals last week and you never do any work thinking about habits, then those goals were a waste of time. Anytime you spent writing them, anytime you spent thinking about them, will be folly for you if there's no time and effort put into the habits that will slowly row you closer and closer toward those goals. The biblical authors understood the importance of habits and consistent disciplines that move us towards our goals. In our passage for this morning, the Apostle Paul emphasizes the absolutely essential role of daily habits and disciplines in the Christian life. And although the extent of, or the context of our passage is narrower than merely goal setting, it's clear that the principle that Paul is talking about has direct application to what we're addressing today. So we're in Galatians chapter 6. I'll go ahead and read it for us again. Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 to 9. Paul says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Paul draws attention here to an obvious and undeniable agricultural reality with implications for everyday life. If a farmer wants a harvest, they have to sow some seed. It's just kind of common sense. If you want tomatoes, you've got to sow tomato seed. If you want corn, you've got to sow some corn. Like, if you want a harvest, you need to spend time sowing in order to get that harvest. If you sow good seed, you'll get a good crop. If you sow bad seed, you'll get a bad crop. This is a common theme and metaphor used, particularly in the New Testament. If you're going to sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. If you're going to sow generously, you will reap generously. Every farmer on planet Earth understands that there's a clear cause and effect relationship between sowing and reaping. This is not rocket science. And as a principle, it seems fairly straightforward, perhaps even obvious. Few would argue with it. And yet, Paul prefaces this statement by saying, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Why, if this is so obvious that there's a connection between sowing and reaping, why would Paul need to put in this little comment, do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked? I think the reason is because every one of us is susceptible to buy into the lie that our actions don't have consequences, especially since there's a delay between sowing and reaping. Farmers get that if you don't put the seed there, nothing's going to come up, but sometimes it feels like, what's going on? I put the seed in and it doesn't seem like anything is happening. The delay between the sowing and reaping can convince us that maybe they're disconnected, that maybe one doesn't lead to the other, that maybe if I do this thing, nothing's going to result from it in my life. It's tempting to think that it doesn't matter, as significant as a single seed, that it really won't make a difference in the long run. And much of the time, it feels like it doesn't make a difference. In the moment of decision, it doesn't feel like our actions always have consequences. If you have a choice between a glass of water and a can of soda, you might pick the soda because it's not like you're going to wake up, fat and unhealthy tomorrow because of it. This action really won't have consequences, we tell ourselves. We can easily convince ourselves that it's the big decisions, the big actions that matter. As long as we get those right, we'll be fine. I would argue that the quality of your life and the direction of your life are determined far more by the cumulative impact of little decisions than by the singular big decisions and actions that you take. Anne Frank once said, "Our lives are fashioned by our choices. First we make our choices, then our choices make us." I think what she means is similar to that old saying, maybe you've heard it, sow a thought and you reap an act, sow an act and you reap a habit, sow a habit and you reap a character, sow a character and you reap a destiny. Our choices make us, they shape our character and form our priorities and end up charting our course. So Paul says, do not be deceived. Don't be deceived that our actions aren't connected to consequences, that there aren't things that we will reap from the little things that we do. Don't be deceived. And then he adds, God cannot be mocked. What Paul is saying is that men and women, we might fool ourselves, but we're not going to fool God. We might think that we can escape this cycle of sowing and reaping, but we can't. We may go on sowing seeds and closing our eyes to the consequences, but one day God himself will bring in the harvest. And using the language of this passage, we can't not sow seed. Like there is no life that isn't investing into some kind of harvest. Like everything that you're doing, you can't just say, well, I'm not gonna sow any seed. I'm not gonna, you're not doing something is going to be sowing into whatever harvest you're gonna get, metaphorically speaking, in your life. Everything that you do is sowing some kind of seed into your future, into the results that you're gonna have, into the direction that you're gonna go. Everything we do is investing in some kind of future harvest. And Paul says we're either sowing to the Spirit or we're sowing to please our sinful nature. If you've got a 1984 NIV, which is what I'm preaching from, it's what the Pew Bibles are, you'll see those words in verse 8, sinful nature. The one who sows to please his sinful nature. In Greek, it's the word sarx. It literally means flesh. It's flesh that's life apart from the Spirit, driven merely by human strength, for human selfish purposes and desires. And Paul says that if you sow to please your flesh, if you sow to please your merely selfish human desires, then you will reap destruction. But if you sow to please the Spirit, from the Spirit you will reap eternal life. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not. I've touched on it from time to time from the pulpit. But in the last 20 years, there has been an explosion of research into the nature of habits and habit formation. And so much of what's being discovered is confirming some very clear, simple biblical principles on things like this. They're the insights into the nature of habits and how they're formed biologically, psychologically, the mechanisms for why these things are the way that they are. Paul was communicating this is a truth, and you've got to reckon with this truth. God cannot be mocked. Don't be deceived. This is something that you need to deal with. But increasingly, we're understanding why this is true, or what's some of the mechanisms that make this play out the way that it does in our minds and in our bodies. Shared a couple of years ago, but it's worth repeating. In his book, The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg provides a helpful summary of some of the science on habit formation. He explains that in the early 1990s, some researchers at MIT began studying a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, kind of a central, small piece of the brain that they suspected was important to habit formation. They noticed that animals that had injured the basal ganglia had difficulty doing repetitive tasks, doing routine things. It's as if they couldn't form habits. And so the scientists wanted to kind of zero in on this to understand some of the mechanisms for how habits form. And one of the things that they did, one of the studies that was done, is they inserted a number of tiny wires into the skull of some rats. And they ended up with kind of this little collection of wires coming out the top, like a little joystick coming out of their head. It's not pretty, but I'm just telling you what happened. And after recovering, the rat would be placed in a maze, a simple T-shaped little maze. There'd be a partition in front of them. They'd lift the partition, and the rat would move forward. Here's a little image of that. Simple. You go straight. To the right is nothing. To the left would be some chocolate. And so the rat would start off, the partition would come up, and they watched and kind of measured in the brain what was going on. And it seemed like the rat was kind of meandering a little, aimlessly kind of through, kind of sniffing and scratching and kind of moving, and sometimes it would go to the right and there'd be nothing there. Eventually the rat would find the chocolate. You could tell that they were smelling something, but, were kind of working their way slowly there. Seemed to be no discernible pattern to the meanderings. Observer would say, oh, they're just kind of taking a leisurely stroll. But the probes in the brains told a very different story. While these rats wandered through the maze, the brains were working furiously. They're firing on all cylinders, trying to figure out where it is and what do we do and how do we get there. I smell chocolate, what's going on? Every scent, sight, sound, processing all kinds of information. What the scientists did was they repeated this hundreds of times with the same rats to see what would happen over time. And after enough times of doing this, as you'd imagine, the rats stopped sniffing corners and making wrong turns, and they got faster and faster through the maze until it got to the point where partition would go up, boom, they know where they're going. They've done this before, straight to the chocolate. And what happened to their brains as they measured this, after this habit was established, it was interesting to kind of look at the brain kind of charts and activity there. Because as they got better and better with this, the more times they did it, the brain activity decreased. As it became more automatic, each rat was thinking less and less. Within a week, they had internalized how to sprint through the maze to such a degree that they hardly needed to think at all. And so when you look at kind of the brain activity chart, first couple times, it's firing on all cylinders, everything's going, but after they've done this hundreds of times, there'd be a little spike at the beginning where the partition goes up, and then they recognize, oh, I know this, I've done this before, and then there's almost no activity, and then they get the chocolate, and there's a little spike again at the end saying like, yes, this habit still works, this is a good thing, keep doing this in the future. And habits are incredibly helpful. They're really good at conserving brain energy. Can you imagine, think about this, can you imagine how exhausting it would be if every action you took required the same concentration as the very first time you did it? Can you imagine that? Think of the first time you ever backed out of the driveway. You're going in slow motion, you keep hitting the brake, you're trying to get used to the way that mirrors adjust how things look. When you turn it this way, kind of the front points that, but then and like all the things that go into what you're doing with your hands and how you're looking, like it's kind of there's a lot that goes into that. But I would imagine now you're just kind of, you're adjusting the radio and snacking on a bagel as you're backing out of the driveway. Like it just becomes so second nature, so automatic. It requires so little thinking. So many things are like this. There are so many things that we do. One cutting-edge psychologist that's doing a lot of research with this estimates that about 5% of the things that we do are actually thought-out, deliberate decisions, and about 95% of what we do is formed in some way by the habits, the rhythms that we've established. Our brains are really good at kind of figuring out how to operate and then doing it as efficiently as possible. We slip so easily into routines. We internalize actions and behavior so much that we don't have to muster motivation. We don't have to put any concentration into it. We just do it. Pastor Andy's not here today, so I can poke a little fun at him. But a week ago, I was here working, and he called me from the parking lot, laughing because he had a meeting in Peabody, not here, somewhere else. But he's driven this path so many times to the church that he came in, parked, started to get out of the car, and then was like, what am I doing? Back into the car, and then he drives to where he actually needs to go. Anyone ever done something like that? Like, you just get so used, like, this is the path that you take all the time, and you end up, like, arriving at a friend's house, and you're like, what am I even doing? Or you get to work, I don't even work today, it's so easy. It's so easy. We just get in habits, you turn the brain off, and when you differ from that habit, it takes concentration to make sure you don't slip into what has become automatic, natural, unconscious. This can be incredibly helpful or incredibly frustrating, depending on the habits you've formed and whether you've been sowing to the flesh or sowing to the spirit. Your habits will work for you and be one of your greatest assets, or they will work against you and be one of your greatest liabilities. Scientists have discovered that once a habit is formed, it never truly goes away. The brain has actually been wired by the repeated behavior. There are synapses that have fired enough that the brain matter actually gets denser, firmer in certain places because you've done this thing so many times. It actually wires your brain to make that more easy and automatic. It's like water that flows. The more it flows down a particular channel, the more that deepens, the bigger the rut gets, the more established it is in that particular path. When we try to change a habit, what we are doing is having to form new mental pathways, new connections, new ruts, essentially. And research shows that while our old pathways never really go away, we can form new ones, and those new ones can be just as strong and entrenched as the old ones were before. We need to stay vigilant because when you go back to an old pattern, like the rat in the maze, when you get back into an old pattern, your brain goes, oh, I recognize this. I've done this before. And it can easily slip back into that old way, which is why some of you, perhaps, if you've tried to quit smoking or break a particular habit, if you put yourself in a situation or circumstance where you always used to do that thing, it's really easy to go right back to behaving the way that you used to behave, and so you need to guard your environments and your situations and the people that you're with and all of those kinds of things because they can trigger your brain going, oh, I know this, I know what comes next, and it can suck you back into that rut. What we sow, we reap. The actions that we do, the choices that we make begin to form these ruts. Now, William James is known as the father of psychology. He understood the critical role of habits long before science has kind of revealed some of the mechanisms of these things. But in his classic work, written in 1890, Principles of Psychology, he writes this about habits. Could the young but realize how soon they will become mere walking bundles of habits, they would give more heed to their conduct while in the plastic state. We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, never to be undone. Every smallest stroke of virtue or of vice leaves its never so little scar. The drunken Rip Van Winkle in Jefferson's play excuses himself for every fresh dereliction by saying, "I will not count this time." Well, he may not count it, but it is being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering and storing it up to be used against him when the next temptation comes. Nothing we ever do is, in a strict scientific literalness, wiped out. Of course, this has its good side as well as its bad one. I don't believe that William James was a Christian, and so I don't agree with everything he says. When he says that we're spinning our fates never to be undone, I don't agree with that. I don't think that our habits are necessarily our destiny. We've all experienced the power of God at work in our lives to change us in a new direction and to break habits that feel like they've become core to who we are. Like God can start a new thing in your life. We are new creations in Him. And so I have a lot more hope for the potential for change than William James reveals here. But we'd be lying to ourselves if we expected it to be easy, if we expected it to be automatic. There is a fight, there is a battle. Too many Christians today want microwave spirituality. We want quick and easy Christian maturity. We want to attend the perfect class or Bible study or listen to the perfect sermon so that we leapfrog past everyone, we accomplish our goals, we get to the state that we want, everything is ordered and straight and righteous in our life. Every godly, mature Christian will tell you it doesn't work that way. You don't accidentally stumble into maturity, you sow into it. You sow into it day after day in little actions that don't seem to have too much by the way of consequences in the moment, but you're sowing for a harvest that you will reap down the road. You harvest the fruit of thousands of little choices to deny your flesh and to feed the Spirit. Your habits, as I said before, will either be your greatest asset or your greatest liability. In 1 Timothy 4, the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, his spiritual son, his protege, who's now leading the church in Ephesus, and he tells him to train himself to be godly. Train himself to be godly. The Greek word for train could just as well be translated habituate. It refers to becoming shaped or conditioned or disciplined by training. The word is actually gymnazo. It's where we get gymnasium. It's the word for working out and exercising, disciplining yourself. It's to have done something so many times, either physically, that your muscles, your lungs, your heart is conditioned for that thing, which becomes easier and more automatic, or spiritually, morally, it's when you've committed to doing something so many times that it becomes easier, more natural, more automatic. But that can work for us or against us. Peter uses this word in 2 Peter 2:12. And the NIV translates it as people who are experts in greed. But literally, it's people whose hearts have been trained in greed. People who've been habituated to greed. They've been living this way for so long that they've established a rut of greed in their life, and it's hard to break out of that rut. Our habits do that to us, and they will either work for you or against you. So if you're going to get what you want in life, if you're going to accomplish your goals, if you're going to know Christ, or whatever that goal might be, and again, of course, my challenge to you is to have a worthy goal, a goal that honors Christ, who ultimately is the only one that's worth being the overarching purpose of our life. But whatever your goal would be, you're going to be wasting your time if you don't commit yourself to some habits that will move you day after day, rowing you closer and closer towards that goal. So my assignment for you this week, last week it was to write down your overarching goal and some secondary goals. I've got another assignment for you this week, is to list out at least one habit for every goal that you have set. You can do more habits than that if you want, but take at least an hour to reflect. And with every goal that you have set, try to articulate one habit, one rhythm that if you establish this thing, if this thing no longer required an extra dose of motivation and effort and energy, if it became automatic, what would be the habit that would move you most towards accomplishing your goal? What small habits, if you could establish them, would make the biggest difference? If you want to know Christ better, what daily habits will sow into that? If you want to take better care of your body, what daily habits will sow into that? If you want to be a better steward of your finances, what daily habits will sow into that? If you want your marriage to be stronger and healthier, what habits are you going to commit to that will sow into that? One of the things that I do with pretty much every premarital counseling couple that I meet with is one of the assignments is to write down all of the habits in your relationship that you would want to be established by the end of your first year of marriage. When you get to your first anniversary, what are all the things, and some of you have been married a long time, you're like, boy, I wish that by year one we had this established and this habit worked out and this thing, because then that just pays dividends for the rest of your marriage. And it's not too late, so if you're like in year 20 or 30 and you're like, oh, okay, like spend some time and write down some goals and start now. But think about what are the things that if I establish this early on, that day after day, year after year, this habit, this thing that I no longer have to work so hard on, will just keep feeding and nourishing and sowing into, again, whether that's your marriage, whether that's your relationship with God, whether that's your finances or your health or whatever it might be. Set aside some time, write down at least one habit for every goal. It's my assignment. And as someone who's spent a fair bit of time thinking about these things, I want to leave you with two practical pieces of advice. These are not just biblical, but just from myself as someone who's tried to do this. Two pieces of advice that I think might help you as you try to decide and establish some habits. Number one, start small. It's really easy to kind of hear a sermon like this and you write a bunch of things down and then it's like, all right, and you try to tackle like 12 things at once. And this week you're like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have hour-long quiet times and I'm going to call my mom who I never call anymore and I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to do this for my wife and I'm going to wake up early and get this done. Like, just pick one thing, start small. It's better to start small with something that you know that you can do and establish that and get momentum with that and then start building on it, expanding on it, adding other things, but don't do too many things so that you feel overwhelmed and give up on it altogether. A small habit established is better than a bunch of big habits that don't go anywhere. So start small, pick one thing. If your longer term goal, if you want to build up to a habit of, 5-hour quiet times, we'll start with 5 minutes. Wait till you get that every day. And if you have some, longer ones, bonus, good for you. But start small and commit to that. Number two, if you're starting a brand new habit, try to piggyback a new habit on an old habit. Something that you've already established, that you're already doing. So if you want a daily habit, if you want to start doing something daily, what's something you're already doing daily? And then see if you can, before or after, connect this new habit to this thing that you're already doing. Because if you want to have, easy example, if you want to have a daily quiet time, reading your Bible and praying, if you don't commit to, this is when I'm going to do this thing, then it's probably not going to happen with any consistency in your life. You've got to say, either this is the time, or this is the thing I'm going to pair it with. So every time I have breakfast, I'm going to bring my Bible, I'm going to open my Bible for breakfast. I'm going to connect these two habits, whatever that might be. If you want to, pray for your spouse every day, what's something you're already doing? Your morning commute, or while you're shampooing your hair, or whatever it might be. What's something you do every day? See if you can attach a new habit to it. If it's a weekly habit, with couples I've talked to who want to do like a weekly checkup, at least once a week. They want to check in with each other. How are we doing? How can I better help you? Is there anything that I haven't been doing or anything you'd like me to do? I think getting into a rhythm of a weekly checkup can be valuable. So what's something you do every week? Is there anything that you do at a weekly frequency? It might be church on Sunday. So maybe your drive to church, or after church you establish this, after church we have lunch and then we talk about how we're doing. Whatever it is, like try to piggyback a new habit on an old one, and my guess is that'll help you make a little bit more progress in doing that. So it's my encouragement for you. Each week we're going to keep building, so we're setting goals, we're building habits. Next week and the weeks after, we're going to continue to build on each of these things. But my challenge is to be a doer of the word, not let this go in one ear and out the other, but to spend some time reflecting on this and writing some things down. Let's pray together. Father God, you have seen far more than us, our weaknesses, how prone to wander we are. You see more clearly than us the sinful, selfish ruts that we've established from years and years of training, as it were. God, help us to not neglect your power, your Spirit. I say with conviction after this whole sermon, not drawing attention to the critical role of your Spirit. God, draw near. Help us to not grind this out in our own strength, but to lean on you, to depend on you, to call out to you. God, would you supply the strength that we need to begin rowing in the right direction? Give us clarity, give us wisdom, give us insight, give us conversations with people who know us well that can sharpen our perspective, that we wouldn't be blind to what's obvious to anyone who's known us for 5 minutes can see. God, help us. Give clarity as we consider habits, and give us strength as we establish them, and help us to persevere, that we would day after day sow to the Spirit and not to the flesh. In your name we pray. Amen.